Nothing stays and nothing lasts. Let me remind you that from the book of Deuteronomy, there is a verse that says, "No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation." So as we move forward, as we've heard from Ruth last week too, I just want to relate a little bit about, and suggest that you look up Home by Warsan, Warsan Shire, Shire, who is a British writer born to Somali parents in Kenya. The poem addresses the reasons some people leave the place of their birth. For instance, my ancestors left Ireland because of the potato famine. Why did yours come here? So the story of Ruth and Naomi is about 12 moments of every woman's life. It's about loss and change and transformation and aging and independence, respect, recognition, insight, empowerment, self-definition, invisibility, and fulfillment. Read the whole book and find it all out. So let me just remind you that from the poem, no one crawls under fences, no one wants to be beaten or pitied, says Warsan Shire. So the poem, look it up. I'll just say, Elimelech and Naomi did not leave home because they wanted to. The desperation described in Shire's poem reflects the desperation these ancient figures must have felt. Though they weren't fleeing war, they were hungry. There was a famine in their homeland, so they were hungry. Their children were hungry. No one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one walks toward the territory of Moab because it's hostile, even God-forsaken. And no one takes their children to Moab unless home will not let them stay, and they have nowhere else to go. There was no small wall to prevent them from going to Moab, no soldiers to separate the children from the parents at the border, no laws to prohibit them. And maybe Moab, maybe it wasn't that bad. After all, Elimelech and Naomi had taken their sons there and settled down, and they began to make a life in Moab. But as too often happens when troubles chase a family from their home, this family's struggle seems to just follow them. Elimelech dies. Now it's just Naomi and her sons, both men, now grown, marry. They marry Moabite women, and things continue for 10 years. And for 10 years, there are no children. It's a different sort of struggle, isn't it? Then the two sons unexpectedly die, and here the Bible's lens comes to focus on Naomi. She is all we see, an aging woman without her children, without her husband, seemingly all alone. And Naomi was not alone. We'll hear more about that with her daughters-in-law. But the way the camera kind of zooms in on Naomi, it reminds me of something Nicholas Wolsteroff said in his book, Lament for a Son. He said that grief isolates. It was important for Wolsteroff to realize that after his own son, Eric, had died, that grief separates and isolates, not only from people who, have gone on about their life, who are happy, but even from the members of his own family who are also grieving. That's because we all grieve differently. Each person's loss had its own unique character, as each person's relationship, for instance, with his son Eric, had its own unique character. The dynamics of their sorrow were so different. More intense one day, less intense another, hardly ever in sync. Now, this is how Naomi was alone in her grief. without her 2 children, without her husband. No one understands exactly how anyone else feels as they walk grief. But Naomi felt alone, but she wasn't alone. And one thing that's striking about this story is the way the three women grieve together. The space they give to their lament. You know, Pastor and Professor Marilyn Pagan Banks, well, she draws my attention to that. She observed that we don't often allow ourselves the chance to truly lament, not as a church, and certainly not as a society. We've gotten really good at moving on, figuring it out. What do we do next? Creating lists, making arrangements. We are not good at lamenting. But some powerful grief is expressed by the women in this story, and through the story, it moved quickly, as it mentioned the moments of death and loss. That's real quick. And the story lingers upon the women's expressions of grief, how they weep and will not be silenced. I wonder why. What about Orpah and Ruth's tears? Did they give, well, maybe they gave permission to their mother-in-law, to Naomi, to say out loud what she'd been feeling deep inside, that the hand of God had turned against her. It can be hard to admit something like that. Maybe Naomi's lament set Orpah free to return to her mother, to do what was best for herself in that moment. The Bible does not judge Orpah, nor should we. Maybe Naomi's tears were what drew Ruth all the way closer. Perhaps as she wept with Naomi, Ruth came to understand where her deepest loyalties lay. To share grief can be powerful for people, and it can be exactly what we need. But it's hard, isn't it? Even just to sit with folks in their grief, it's really hard. And Kate Bowler, I've mentioned her before, she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer at the age of 35. And she's written about this, you know, how something terrible happens and we rush in with explanations and reassurance. She believes that one of the main reasons we do this is that we want to believe life is durable. We want to think that if we live carefully and well, we can avoid danger. We can avoid illness. We can avoid heartache. We live with what Bowler calls, well, a thick cultural script around positivity. There are religious aspects to that script, like the idea that it's all part of God's plan, and God won't give you anything you can't handle. There's also just the popular notion that today may be hard, but tomorrow will be better. That if you work hard and have the right attitude, you'll rise to the top. Those notions are compelling, Bowler says, especially for those of us who are trying to find agency in our lives, or if no one has ever told you to believe in yourself, to hear that the best is yet to come. It's compelling. But these notions can be inadvertently cruel, like for people who are living with a chronic illness or condition, or for folks who can't live their best lives now because, well, they're caring for somebody else, aging parents, maybe somebody sick and disabled, maybe children to raise, children to care for, or for the people like Naomi, whose home has chased them away, whose loved ones have died, whose lives have just totally unraveled. Bowler says, I think our culture makes us feel really embarrassed for the terrible things that happen to us. It makes us feel ashamed and lonely and fundamentally like a loser. Bowler says that since getting sick, she's come to embrace the idea of precarity of life. You know, that's the idea that things are contingent, they're delicate, they aren't always sure. And Bowler says she latched on to the word because it means I don't have to pretend that things were once durable and that I'm supposed to just get back to durability. Our lives are built with such delicate material, she says. It doesn't take a lot to topple the whole thing over. Naomi and Ruth and Orpah knew that too well. And they didn't try to look on the bright side. They didn't try to cheer each other up. They just wept and held on to each other as best they could. We don't hear any more about Orpah's story, but we do know, if we read to the end of the book, that for Ruth and Naomi, the story ends well. A good man marries Ruth and gives both Ruth and Naomi safety in his home. And Ruth becomes pregnant and has a healthy baby boy. And Naomi hugs the child to her chest. And the whole neighborhood celebrates with her gladness. And the baby becomes the father of Jesse. And the grandfather of David, Israel's greatest king. Who'd have thought this? After all, they are part Moabite, the ones that early on in that book of Deuteronomy said they will never be to the 10th generation part of Israel. Who would have thought it? And it's all understood to be the work and the will of God. So if you and I had been there, knowing what we know, we might have wanted to say, hang in there, girls. Love of God has a plan for you. Tomorrow will be better. But not even the all-knowing narrator does that. Here in the midst of these women's grief, the ending is not shouted till the end. The story is patient. The narrator is restrained. The women are left to feel what they feel, and the grief does its mysterious work. Part of what I appreciate about this story is the way it begins so unassumingly. So far, other books have started dramatically with God beginning to create the heavens and the earth, or as the Israelites came into Egypt with households that were fertile and became prosperous, with the Lord calling to Moses from the meeting tent, and Moses addressing the Israelites with Joshua leading God's people across Jordan into that promised land. It's very obvious in those stories, big things are about to happen. This story starts with a few people whose lives have been unraveled, who are desperate, who fear they have nothing left to live for. They command our attention only because the narrator knows they deserve our attention. The narrator knows that sometimes God is most powerfully at work when we are least inclined to believe it. So I have resourced through Joan Chittister's book on Ruth. And now I ask that as you read the entire book of Ruth, you keep in mind that no Moabite was ever to be one of those in the community of the Israelites. Things do change. Nothing stays forever. And the people said, Amen.